Connie Margota was born in Rockville, Connecticut on July 31, 1976, to parents Cindy and Kenneth. Connie was one of 4 siblings, having 2 sisters, Marlise and Leslie, and a brother, Keith. The Margota children grew up in Vernon and Ellington. Connie attended Ellington High School, where she graduated in 1995, after which Connie attended the University of Connecticut. She attained her undergraduate degree in 1999 and began working as a pharmaceutical sales representative for Reckitt Benckiser. Everyone who knew Connie described her as a warm-hearted, generous person who would do anything for those she loved. Connie had many friends and was popular among everyone she met. In the early 2000s, Connie told her close friends about a man she had met. His name was Richard Dabate, and Connie was smitten. He was a handsome man who treated Connie like a queen. When Connie was introduced to Richard's family, they immediately knew that she was the one for him. Richard, or Rick as he was known, was born on July 29, 1976, to parents Richard Sr. and Julie Dabate. He grew up in Manchester, Connecticut, and graduated from Manchester High School in 1995. After finishing high school, Rick attended technical school before beginning his career in computer network administration. Ricky and Connie married on July 4, 2003, and had 2 sons, RJ and Connor. Connie was a devoted mother to her boys, and Rick seemed like the perfect husband and family man. The Dabates lived in a beautiful home in Ellington on Birchview Drive. 2 of Connie's closest friends, Peggy and Darlene, lived in the same neighborhood. Their families spent plenty of time together, with Peggy and Darlene often joking about what a doting husband Rick was to Connie. From any outside perspective, life for the Dabates looked picture perfect. They seemed to have it all. In reality, cracks had started to show. December 23, 2015 started like any other day. It was a Wednesday, and everyone in Ellington felt the festive cheer with Christmas just 2 days away. At 8:10 a.m., Rick dropped Connor and RJ off at the nearby bus stop. While he was out, Connie dressed and headed to a spin class at the local YMCA. What happened next is unclear, as Rick has given many differing versions of events. This is what he first told investigators after the incident. Rick dropped off the boys and then returned home to change into his work clothes. Once he was ready, Rick got back into his car at 8:30 a.m. and set off on the 40-minute drive to work. He wasn't on the road for long until he realized his laptop was still at home. Rick couldn't work without it, so he went onto his cell phone and emailed his supervisor that he would be late. As Rick looked at his phone, he happened to see a security alert about a silent alarm that had been triggered at his home. He mentioned this in the email as well. Rick headed back home and cautiously went inside. Rick heard a noise coming from upstairs, and upon further investigation, it sounded like someone was in their main bedroom. The door was partially opened, and when Rick looked inside, he was confronted by a masked intruder. It was a large-framed man standing roughly 6 foot 2 inches tall, wearing a dark green camouflaged outfit and mask. The intruder pulled out a knife and told Rick something along the lines of, "Give me your money, your wallet, and your pins, and if you don't, I'm going to wait here for your wife and kids." The man had a deep voice, which Rick compared to sounding like Vin Diesel. Rick had been with the intruder for less than a minute when he heard the sound of their garage door opening. It was Connie. Her class had been canceled and she was back early. Rick screamed out to her, desperately trying to alert his wife to the danger in their house. The intruder then apparently turned his attention to Connie, and he and Rick were in a race to reach her first. In the struggle, Rick was pushed down the stairs and was briefly disoriented. The intruder managed to get past him and pursue Connie into the basement. Rick was able to pick himself up off the floor and rush to Connie's rescue, but it was too late. As he sped down the stairs, a gunshot rang out. It was so loud that his hearing was affected for several minutes afterward. The intruder turned his focus back on Rick, where he overpowered him by using a certain pressure point that caused him to collapse. The next thing Rick knew, he had been partially tied to a metal folding chair with zip ties. The intruder had grabbed a box cutter from Rick's toolbox and inflicted superficial wounds on Rick's body with it. The intruder next grabbed a blowtorch, which he used to burn random items. He then tried to use the blowtorch on Rick, but Rick was able to use his free hand and grab the blowtorch from the intruder. He aimed it at the man's face and burnt him, despite Rick previously saying the man had a mask on. The entire ordeal lasted 5 minutes before Rick scared the man off after the blowtorch incident. Looking at the original timeline, this meant that it would now be no later than 9:05 a.m. Rick only calls the police at 10:21 a.m. State troopers were already on their way, as a call had been automatically placed to them at 10:16 a.m. from the security company regarding an alarm triggered at home. This alert gets sent to authorities immediately. So why did it not get sent after the alert that Rick allegedly saw shortly past 8:30 a.m.? The first to arrive at 7 Birchview Drive was a member of the Ellington Fire Department. He noticed the front door was open, but the storm door was still closed. He knocked with no answer and proceeded inside. He first noticed a light layer of smoke that hung in the air. The basement door was open and droplets of blood led from the basement toward the kitchen. The man followed the trail where he found Rick. Rick was still attached to the folding chair, lying face down on the kitchen floor. Rick told the man that he is still in the house, referring to the intruder. The man quickly called for backup, reporting the crime as a home invasion, and soon a flood of officers were on the scene. They focused on locating the gunman as soon as possible. The investigators started taking note of everything in the house. They took multiple images of Rick on the floor, showing how he had been tied to the metal chair. Curiously, it was only Rick's left hand and left ankle that was zip-tied. Connie was found in the basement's boiler room. She had been shot twice, once in the stomach and in the back of the head. She was pronounced deceased at the scene. This was no longer just a home invasion. Canine units were soon on the scene, hoping they would show investigators which direction the gunman had gone in. But the dogs seemed only to be focused on one person, Rick Dabate. One of the dogs found Rick's wallet on the lawn outside, presumably where the intruder had dropped it while fleeing. Still, the dogs could not follow a scent leading away from the property. Instead, they led their handlers to the ambulance where Rick was being treated for his superficial wounds. From the get-go, investigators saw holes in Rick's story. Rick was taken to Hartford Hospital. This is where he was first questioned about the events that day. He described the intruder to the investigators and told them he had seen the man shoot Connie in the basement. After he said his version of events, the investigators had some follow-up questions for Rick. This was when they noticed Rick's story changing slightly, which is always a red flag. There was confusion about the alarm system, when Rick saw the alarm alert, and whether he had been the one who set it off. Initially, Rick said he left before Connie dropped the boys off. This changed to him saying he couldn't remember who left first. The next thing that changed was his explanation of the sound upstairs. Now, Rick hadn't heard a sound when he first entered. Instead, he went upstairs and noticed the bedroom light was on. He then came across the intruder rifling through their closet. The next story change involved the staircase. Remember that Rick first said he was pushed down the stairs. Now he was saying he tripped down them. Most important to investigators was the gun story. The gun used to shoot Connie was a .357 Magnum. It was one of Rick's guns that he kept in the house. He first told investigators that he was unsure how the intruder got the gun from Connie. Now he said he saw Connie and the man wrestling for the gun. The man pulled it from Connie, and he then shot her. Oh, and the basement was also dark during all of this, apparently. Rick told investigators how he dragged himself up the stairs, still attached to the metal chair, after he regained consciousness. He found his cell phone and called for help, all while calling out to Connie, hoping she would call back. Rick's injuries were conveniently located. The wounds to his chest were only found on his left side, and the wounds to his legs were all within reach of his right hand. This piqued the investigators' interest. He also had no injuries that would suggest he had been pushed or fallen down the stairs. The dried blood from the box cutter marks hadn't dripped down the edges of his legs like you would expect if the wounds had been inflicted while he was sitting on the metal chair. The other inconsistency that stood out to investigators was the lack of blood leading up the stairs. If Rick had dragged himself from the basement to the kitchen, you would expect to see evidence of that. Instead, only droplets were found on that path, and the only drag marks were found in the kitchen. Rick seemed to have walked upstairs before collapsing in the kitchen. Investigators were also curious why Rick hadn't tried to check on Connie. The evidence shows he hadn't been near the body after she was shot, as the pool of blood near her body was undisturbed. Investigators wanted to find out exactly how an intruder was able to get into the home. They theorized they had entered through an open basement window, as the rest of the house showed no sign of forced entry. But even this didn't make sense. The locks on the basement window were removed from the inside and just left on the windowsill. An intruder wouldn't have been able to access these locks from outside without leaving significant damage. So why would Rick or Connie have removed these locks without immediately replacing them? It is customary for investigators to question those closest to a victim to get an idea of their life in general and any possible problems they were experiencing. After running through that morning's events, the investigators asked Rick about his relationship with Connie. He started off by saying things had been pretty good, but added that Connie was going through some things lately. She was battling with depression and had been noticeably easy to anger, something very unusual for the usually cheerful mom of two. Rick did say that Connie seemed to be slowly returning back to her old self, though. The investigators then bluntly asked Rick whether their investigation would reveal any problems in their relationship. To which Rick replied, yes and no. Rick revealed he had been having an affair, but he had an explanation for this. He claimed that both he and Connie were wanting to add another child to their family, but health problems were standing in the way of that. Connie was unable to conceive, and after several attempts, they decided to explore a different route. Rick told the investigators about Sarah, an old friend from high school who was newly divorced. Sarah also happened to want to have a child. Rick explained that the three of them, meaning Rick, Connie, and Sarah, got together and came up with a plan that Rick would get Sarah pregnant. Since the entire artificial insemination was so costly, the group agreed that Rick would sleep with Sarah and get her pregnant that way. He insisted that Connie agreed to the whole thing, even adding that it was actually mainly her idea. So how would the parenting work? Apparently, all three of them would co-parent the child together. The investigators couldn't make sense of such a bizarre story and felt skeptical that Connie would agree to something like that. They asked Rick more questions about this situation, and yet again his story started to shift. He told them that their baby was due in February 2016, but when asked whether Connie knew about the pregnancy, he wouldn't give the investigators a straight answer. If this had all been Connie's idea, surely she would have found out the good news as soon as Rick had. Rick then added that Connie and Sarah hadn't actually ever spoken. Yet again, this punched major holes in his story about Connie's involvement in the plan and their eventual co-parenting. By the end of the conversation, the real story came out. Rick had been unfaithful to Connie for years leading up to her passing. Sarah's pregnancy was also unplanned. The investigators didn't try to hide their disbelief. They told Rick that his entire story didn't make sense and added that the evidence at their home didn't match what he said happened that morning. He insisted he wasn't responsible for what happened to Connie. After hearing about Rick's affair, the investigators focused on tracking down Sarah. She was able to give them a statement later that same day. Sarah admitted to knowing that Connie and Rick were married, but said Rick had told her he was getting a divorce. Rick told Sarah that he and Connie had been unhappy for years and that the divorce was a mutual decision. Sarah found out she was pregnant on June 18, 2015, and waited until August to break the news to Rick. But when Rick found out, he told Sarah he had recently hired a divorce attorney. Like many other things had been, this was a lie. Sarah and Rick were still in an active relationship shortly before Connie lost her life, even traveling to Vermont in mid-December 2015. During this trip, the pair discussed how they would break the news to Connie. Rick wanted to wait until after the holidays to tell her. During subsequent conversations with Connie's closest friends, investigators discovered that Connie would never have accepted Rick having a child with another woman. Connie shared everything with her close friends, who said she never mentioned Sarah or the child's situation. She would have undoubtedly told them if she found out Rick was unfaithful. While Connie's friends were none the wiser to Rick's affair, Rick's friends, on the other hand, did know about Sarah and the pregnancy. He told a friend how much he loved Sarah and that he was afraid Connie would leave him. The entire investigation team was in a precarious position. From the get-go, though, they felt that Rick was involved in his wife's slaying. This was something they kept private from the public. To everyone outside of law enforcement, they believed that an intruder had broken in and taken Connie's life, leaving Rick injured. Those close to Rick hadn't even considered the possibility that he had something to do with Connie's passing, and they grieved alongside him. While they clearly had a main suspect, the investigators didn't want to lose focus on exploring all possibilities. The Dabates did have someone who would potentially want to hurt them. They had been involved in a long-standing legal battle with a contractor who worked on the house. Connie and Rick sued the man in small claims court after multiple problems with the contractor's work, and Connie had even expressed concern about her safety. The man was difficult to deal with, and Connie's car had even been vandalized twice in 2015. She believed the contractor was behind it. After these incidents, the Dabates installed their security system and purchased guns. The contractor even came up multiple times when friends of Connie and Rick were questioned after her passing. But this lead fell flat after the contractor was found to have an airtight alibi on the day of the crime, and he didn't at all match Rick's description of the intruder. While no one other than law enforcement suspected Rick was involved in Connie's demise, many people noted odd behavior from him. He didn't seem to be grieving how you would expect. Not long after the incident, Rick placed a message on the neighborhood group asking everyone where they liked to get takeout food. This seemed off for a man who had recently lost his wife in such traumatic circumstances. As investigators peeled back the layers of the Dabates' lives, they uncovered some glaring financial issues. Money was going out faster than was coming in, and Connie felt like all the responsibilities were resting on her shoulders. She told her close friend she was thinking about separating from Rick, and even had a file on her notes app titled, "Why I Want a Divorce." The reasons ranged from Rick's lying to his poor treatment of her and not being a good father to the boys and focusing only on himself. Money is often a motive in cases like these, and in mid-January 2016, investigators found out about 2 life insurance policies for Connie and Rick. Each policy was for the hefty sum of $475,000. It turned out that only Connie's life insurance was still valid, as Rick's had lapsed due to non-payment. Rick waited just 5 days to claim Connie's insurance money. He also received $75,000 from her employer a month after her passing. Over the next year, investigators slowly built their case against Rick Dabate. They executed multiple search warrants, looking into both Rick and Connie's phone records, financial statements, communications with outside parties, security system data, and most importantly, Connie's Fitbit. Connie's Fitbit showed she had first been active at 7:52 a.m. on the morning of December 23rd. This was followed by an extended period of inactivity, consistent with Connie driving to the YMCA, the search warrant stated. We know Connie arrived at the YMCA as she was spotted on surveillance cameras. Then her Fitbit again registered another 10 minutes of inactivity when Connie was driving back home. She was back at the house at around 9:20 a.m. From 9:37 a.m. to 9:43 a.m., she was stationary. Investigators believe Connie was just resting during this time. The next 20 minutes saw Connie moving around like normal. During this time, Connie posted videos from her phone to Facebook with an IP address linked to her house. The last time Connie's Fitbit picked up any movement from her was at 10:05 a.m. So why was this so significant? This information provided concrete evidence that Connie's life was not taken at the time that Rick stated it had been. Connie was alive and moving until 10:05 a.m., an hour after Rick said he had witnessed the intruder take her life. Once they felt like they had enough evidence to convict Rick Dabate, authorities arrested him on April 14, 2017. He was charged with taking Connie's life, evidence tampering, and giving false statements to investigators. Rick pleaded not guilty to the charges. The police had a 50-page affidavit that included the Fitbit information, Rick's contradictions, and his affair with Sarah. The news of Rick's arrest rocked the close-knit community of Ellington. No one had given a thought to him being responsible. Even Connie's close friends, who she had spoken with about her marriage issues, thought many people go through difficulties without it ending like this. His bail was set at $1 million, which he posted immediately. Despite the mountain of evidence, it was a while before the case was actually taken to trial. It had been postponed twice before it kicked off on April 5, 2022. From his arrest to his trial, Connie's case received a lot of media attention. It became known as a case that was solved by a Fitbit, which Connie's family didn't approve of. They felt that it took the focus off of Connie to get a catchy headline. While it seemed like the prosecution had a clear-cut case, the defense was able to bring forward some damning information. Unidentified DNA had been found in the home in 6 separate places. This DNA coincides with Rick's story about the intruder starting off in their closet, moving down the stairs, and ending in the basement. The other evidence that the defense used was the gunshot residue found on Rick. The amount found on him was insignificant. You would expect there to be much more had he been the one to pull the trigger. The prosecution was able to counter this by explaining that the test had been administered hours after the trigger was pulled, meaning his hands could have easily been wiped or washed during that time. The prosecution stated a clear motive from the get-go. Rick's life was falling apart around him, with Sarah's pregnancy and Connie thinking about leaving him. Attorney Matthew C. Gdansky told juries, "Time is moving on. The pressure is mounting, the baby is coming, and the defendant's worst fears are going to be realized." Following the 5-week trial, on May 10, 2022, the jury deliberated for 3 hours before reaching a verdict. Richard Dabate was guilty of all charges. Connie and her family finally got justice after 6.5 long years. Judge Corinne Klatt handed down a sentence of 65 years in prison. She called the crime a brutal, calculating, and incomprehensible act. Her sentence fell just a year short of the maximum penalty. While his lawyer did signal they will be filing an appeal, it is safe to say Richard will spend his remaining days behind bars. During the trial, Judge Klatt got to know the wonderful woman that Connie was. She was a loving mother, a hard worker, and a best friend to many. As Judge Klatt so beautifully put it, the world is truly a lesser place without Connie in it. Lisa Ziegert was born in Holyoke, Massachusetts on March 24, 1968, to parents George and Diane. She had 3 siblings, David, Lynn, and Sharon. Lisa and her family moved to Agawam, Massachusetts in 1974. She graduated from Agawam High School in 1986. While in high school, she played tenor saxophone and flute in the concert band. She had also been a drum majorette for the school's marching band for 2 years. Lisa worked for the school newspaper and literary magazine. After school, Lisa became a member of the National Honor Society and the American Field Service. In 1990, Lisa received a degree in elementary education from Westfield State College. Lisa was a communicant of Sacred Heart Church and taught confraternity of Christian doctrine classes there. Lisa loved to draw and often gave pieces of her artwork to her friends and family. She remained close to her family as a young adult and had a close group of friends. She had a boyfriend named Blair. He co-owned a house where many of their friends lived together. Lisa became a teacher's aide in the special education department at Agawam Middle School. Unfortunately, it did not pay well, so she had to get extra work. One of those jobs was working as a clerk at Brittany Card and Gift Shop. She also worked at the Perry Lane Camp for 4 summers. It is a summer camp for residents of Agawam. April 15, 1992 started like any other day for 24-year-old Lisa Ziegert. It was just a few days away from Easter. After a long day of teaching special needs students, Lisa hopped in her car and drove over to her night job at Brittany's Card and Gift Shop in Agawam. The 24-year-old with dark curly hair, freckles, and blue eyes was scheduled to work until closing time at 9 p.m. Lisa spent most of her shift putting helium into balloons as shoppers filled their carts with gifts and decorations for the upcoming holiday. At around 5:30 p.m., an unexpected visitor walked into the store, Lisa's sister, Lynn. It was a rare chance for the siblings to catch up. They chatted about Lisa's job at the school, where she was beloved by students, and her future goals. After about half an hour, Lynn left the store and drove home, glad that all seemed well with her sister. The following morning, Lisa's co-worker, Sophia Maynard, showed up as usual to open the shop. When she spotted Lisa's white Chevy Geostorm in the parking lot and saw that the store's open sign was still outside the door, alarm bells started ringing in her head. The front door was unlocked and the lights were on. A radio was playing in the background. Sophia called out Lisa's name, but received no reply. She walked up to the cash register and saw that Lisa's car keys and purse were left behind. When Sophia walked into the storeroom to look for her friend, she noticed that the back door was open and several boxes had toppled over. Sophia began to panic. She ran out of the store and across the street to Alvin's sandwich shop. "Something's wrong," she shouted. "Call the cops." Minutes later, officers arrived at the store and found evidence of a struggle. There were shoe markings on the back door and a small amount of blood in the storeroom. The police theorized she had been taken out the back entrance and into an alley. 2 doors and a card rack were removed by police and taken as evidence. Interestingly, the cash register was undisturbed. It did not appear to be a robbery. Local officers, aided by Massachusetts State Police detectives and the FBI, spent hours scouring the banks and watery depths of the Westfield River on foot and from the sky with a state police helicopter. They could find no trace of Lisa. Lisa had not reported to work at Agawam Middle School, which was unusual enough that the school called her mother. Her family then also started searching for Lisa. A police officer said that he saw that the lights of the shop were still on at about 3 a.m., a few hours before Sophia entered the shop. He did not call it in because he had to transport a prisoner. Lisa was last seen when she spoke to the owner of the carpet store next door for about 15 minutes around 7:35 p.m., an hour and a half before her shift ended. They commiserated over the parking problems at the shopping center caused by people using its lot when going to the nearby bowling alley instead of the stores in the center. Before he left, he told Lisa he would not be challenging any drivers because there are a lot of crazy people out there. The last transaction in the shop occurred at 8:20 p.m. Another customer arrived at the store at 9:05 but found it empty. She thought she heard a noise coming from the back of the store, but left without investigating it. This meant that Lisa vanished sometime between ringing out the purchase at 8:20 p.m. and when the customer arrived just after 9 p.m. On April 17th, Agawam Police Lieutenant Robert Campbell told the press that the chances of Lisa simply walking away from the store were slim. He announced that the case was considered a kidnapping, as their investigation had ruled out any other possibilities. 3 days after Lisa went missing, on April 19th, it was Easter Sunday. All 12 churches in Agawam passed out white ribbons for their congregants to wear. It was a sign of hope that Lisa would soon be found and of support for her family at their services that morning. Later that day at around 2 a.m., a man was hiking with his dog along a mud-caked path in the woods 4 miles from the gift shop when he stumbled upon what appeared to be a partially clothed body of a young woman. Based off of the clothing of the body and a charm bracelet on her wrist, the woman was quickly identified as Lisa Ziegert. Lisa had suffered 7 stab wounds around her shoulder and throat, some more than an inch deep, and another knife wound to her upper left leg. Her light blue denim skirt and blood-soaked white blouse were pulled down toward her ankles. The cuts on her hands led detectives to think she had not gone down without a fight. An autopsy would later confirm their hunch that she had been assaulted by a man. Police discovered male DNA and blood all over her clothes and body. After visiting the crime scene, Agawam Police Detective Wayne Macy sped over to the Ziegert house. He feared that if he slowed down at all, he would lose his nerve and leave the difficult task of informing Lisa's family to someone else. He tried to think of the least offensive word he can use to tell them that Lisa was not alive anymore. It turned out he did not have to come up with a euphemism. When Lisa's mother opened the door for him, she already knew, based on the fact that he had come to their home. Lisa's funeral took place at Sacred Heart Church. More than 900 people were in attendance. Joseph O'Neill, the owner of Brittany's card and gift shop, made the decision to permanently close the store. He had been considering doing so for some time, but the dismay he felt knowing Lisa had been taken from the store and the grief he felt over his employee's demise finalized his decision. After the crime, fear spread through the town. Young women from Agawam and the surrounding communities signed up for self-defense classes in droves and insisted someone walk them to their cars at night. Within 2 days of the discovery of Lisa's body, more than 300 women had filed permits to carry firearms or mace. Police offered check-ins at businesses that were open late to ensure the safety of the people working there. All 8 members of the Detective Bureau at the Agawam Police Department were put on the case. The FBI provided resources for the investigation, and the Connecticut State Police were brought in because of the proximity of the site where Lisa's body had been found to the state border. Lisa's case was worked on nearly constantly, with investigators working shifts of 18 hours or longer spanning every day of the week. Investigators received many calls from residents with possible leads. One of those leads led them to Gary Shara. Let me explain what that lead was. It started with Noelle Deslauriers. She was a 22-year-old nursing student living with her parents in nearby Longmeadow at the time of Lisa's slaying. She was gripped by Lisa's case. Day after day, she sat glued to the TV coverage of the case as police searched for the perpetrator. 9 months later, in January 1993, Noelle was in a patient's house working as a home health aide when a breaking news update shot across the television screen. It was another local case that was unfolding in real time. Reporters were interviewing a man who said his infant son had been abducted. Noelle realized she knew the man. The infant's father was Gary Shara, whom she had briefly dated while they were students at Longmeadow High School in 1986. A few days after seeing him on the television, Noelle was surprised to pick up the phone and hear Gary's voice on the other end of the line asking her out to dinner. They had not seen each other since high school, but she remembered Gary fondly and agreed to meet him a few days later at Collegian Court. It's a historical restaurant and banquet hall in Chicopee, Massachusetts. During dinner, Gary pulled out his wallet and showed Noelle a photo of his infant son. 1 month later, the mystery of the boy's abduction was solved when police found Gary's son living with his mother across the country in Seattle. Suddenly, what was once a kidnapping case was chalked up to a messy custody dispute. Through her attorney, Gary's wife Joyce McDonald made a startling claim to Agawam detectives. She told them that Gary was responsible for taking Lisa's life. She added that he had an obsession with the case. Agawam police had never heard of Gary Shara before. He had no criminal record, and there was not any evidence linking him to the crime. Since the beginning of the investigation, detectives had been flooded with tips from angry former wives and girlfriends who tried to pin the crime on the men who had done them wrong. Detectives quickly placed Joyce's allegations against her ex into that category and dismissed the tip. Even her own family did not take Joyce's claims seriously. She had a long history of alcoholism. At least one relative, according to news reports, said she was convinced Joyce was just being a crazy drunk. Weeks and months went by without a prime suspect in the case. When months turned into years and no other similar crimes were committed, residents began to relax, all but forgetting it seemed that the perpetrator was still on the loose. Mark Fow worked the case from the beginning, starting in 1993 as an Agawam police officer with a 4 p.m. to midnight shift, during which he fielded phone calls and read the volumes of information about Lisa's slaying. In 2001, Mark had been recently promoted to detective sergeant and took the reins of Lisa's case. He was determined to revive it after the original lead investigator retired. Mark scanned through everything in the files. As a result of Joyce McDonald's claim, Mark asked to interview her former husband, Gary. Gary had declined an earlier request to sit for an interview, but this time he agreed. When Gary showed up at the Agawam police station a few months later in 2002, he was polite and cordial. After Mark asked him to submit a DNA sample to clear his name, things turned sideways. Gary refused to give a sample, saying he was scared of being secretly cloned. In the meantime, Lisa's family kept pressuring the police for answers. Her mother, Dee Ziegert, appeared on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. It led to a lot of new leads, but none of them were fruitful. Lisa's mother also organized charity golf tournaments to raise money for college scholarships and took part in candlelight vigils in her daughter's memory. "We want people to know that we will not forget, we will not give up," she told a reporter. "Someone knows something, and we hope that they will have the courage to come forward." By March 2015, Noelle Delorier found herself alone and struggling through a messy divorce. Heartbroken, she isolated herself for several months until her friend invited her to another high school reunion dinner. Gary Shara was there at the reunion. There, Noelle and Gary talked all night and soon after started dating. Noelle believed she had finally met Mr. Right. Gary had a steady job as a shuttle driver for Enterprise Rental at nearby Bradley International Airport in Connecticut. He loved animals and was especially good with children. Noel thought he might be overcompensating because he had no contact with his own son, who was living with relatives in Seattle. An orphan, like the fictional Bruce Wayne, Gary had a deep affinity for Batman movies. He had a collection of Batman t-shirts. Gary's adoptive parents had taken custody of him as a small child after he had bounced from foster home to foster home in California. The family eventually moved to Western Massachusetts for Gary's high school years. Soon after they started dating, Noel began to notice odd behavior from Gary. It seemed as if he suffered from anxiety around crowds. When they went to the Boston Marathon, he refused to walk through the police checkpoint, and he was white with fear. As time went on, Noel began to wonder whether perhaps it wasn't the crowds he was trying to avoid, but police. One day, Noel recruited Gary to chauffeur her wheelchair-bound patient to the girls' senior prom at a local country club. After the dance, the teen struggled with a disability ramp and nearly fell out of her chair. Gary rushed to the girl's aid and saved her from landing onto the concrete sidewalk. The patient was okay, but protocol required Noel to call 911. When police arrived, Gary was nowhere to be found. Noel later learned he had hidden behind the transportation van while the officers interviewed her about the incident. By 2016, police were solving one cold case after another thanks to advancements in DNA evidence. With Lisa's case, that meant they were able to put together a digital composite image of the perpetrator. A man of European extraction with some freckling, dark eyes, and black or dark brown hair. District Attorney Anthony Gallooni said, "All evidence and leads previously developed in this case are now being evaluated in view of this new forensic development. The technology that we have put to use is at the leading edge of the industry." With their mission renewed, State Police Trooper Noah Pack and Detective Sergeant Mark Fow once again began poring over the stacks of case files. They focused on 11 suspects who matched the new digital composite and had refused to provide a DNA sample when questioned. After taking the case to a grand jury, Anthony Gallooni received a court order granting him permission to force any unwilling suspect to provide a DNA sample, including Gary Shera. On Wednesday, September 13, 2017, Noah Pack visited Gary's residence in West Springfield, Massachusetts. He lived with a roommate in a two-bedroom apartment on the first floor of a large two-family home. At the front door, Noah told the roommate he was there to see Gary. The man told Noah that Gary was not home, but said he would relay the message. Later that day, Gary called Noel and asked if he could stay at her place for the night. Noel found the request a bit odd. Gary never spent the night at her home during the week while he was working. But he told her that the traffic around his street was intense because of the hordes of visitors flocking to the gates of the Big E fair nearby, and he was worried about being late to work the next morning. Gary arrived at Noel's home 20 minutes later, and they settled into a relaxing evening of dinner and TV. The next morning, she woke up before dawn and got dressed for work while Gary slept. When Noel returned home at 4:30 p.m. after an exhausting 10-hour shift, she noticed Gary had left his wallet, his watch, and a handful of coins on the kitchen counter. She tried calling his cell phone, but the device was shut off, so she couldn't even leave a message. Noel then noticed a clipboard belonging to Gary on the coffee table. Attached to it was a letter with Noel's name written on top in Gary's handwriting. Here is what he wrote, with a few words changed to accommodate YouTube guidelines. "You are going to find out some awful things about me today. They will tell you I abducted, assaulted, and took the life of a young woman approximately 25 years ago. It is true, all of it. I had no intention of taking her life when I grabbed her, but events spun out of my control. And in the eyes of the law, it is all the same. I have never regretted anything so much. I always knew one day it would catch up to me, and now it has. I received a text from my roommate last night that the state police were at the house with important papers for me. That will be a warrant to take DNA, and that will send me away for life. I have never really been or felt normal. From a young age, I was fascinated by abduction. I could never keep it too far from my mind for long. On that fateful day, I let myself do something terrible. I've never forgiven myself for that. I also never did anything of the like again. I hated what happened. I despised myself. I thought of turning myself in hundreds of times over the years, but I am truly a coward. Today it will all end. I will either take my own life or face the music, as it were. Gary Shara. The next 2 pages included Shara's last will and testament, and also a letter to Lisa's family. In the letter, he expressed remorse for the slaying, and wrote that he could never apologize enough for taking their daughter and siblings' life. "I neither expect or deserve your forgiveness," he wrote, "but I hope knowing who I am and knowing I am gone will bring you some closure and peace. I am truly so sorry." At first, Noelle didn't believe it. She thought that he was having a psychotic breakdown and that he had only imagined committing this heinous crime. Even though she had her doubts, Noelle knew she had to give the letter to the police. She scrambled into her car and drove to the Massachusetts State Police Barracks in Westfield. Noelle ran into the station and asked to speak with someone working on Lisa Ziegert's case. Investigators were stunned when she showed them the letters. They had believed DNA would identify the perpetrator, but they never thought they would see a confession before a DNA test was performed. Police interrogated her into the night, asking hundreds of questions. Most important of all, where was Shara? After saying she was afraid that he took his own life and was hanging from a tree somewhere, Noelle added that she still loved him very much. In Agawam, Mark Fow got a call from the state police, jumped into his squad car, and raced to the barracks to read the letters for himself. He stayed silent as he digested every word. To Mark, the letters did not reveal a full confession. After all, Shara did not detail much about the crime. But it was clear to the veteran detective that Shara was attempting to clear his conscience. Mark Fow then reflected on a visit he had paid to Joyce McDonald's relatives in Seattle, where they told him she had received a music box, like the one sold at Brittany's card and gift shop, from Shara on the night Lisa's life was taken. Detectives pinged Shara's cell phone and tracked its GPS coordinates to Stratford Springs, Connecticut. It was just past 10 p.m. when police found his black Honda Civic in the parking lot of Johnson Memorial Hospital. There was no sign of Shara, but he had left a note on the dashboard. "To whomever finds my body, I apologize for any psychological trauma incurred. All Mass State Police, thank you." Hours earlier, Shara had swallowed a fistful of ibuprofen, but he immediately grew scared and walked into the emergency room, where doctors pumped his stomach and admitted him overnight. He was then put into the critical care unit, and once detectives arrived, they placed him under arrest as a fugitive from justice. Noelle waited outside her home while investigators searched each room for evidence. They took Shara's toothbrush and a full syringe of insulin used to treat his diabetes. They even searched the well under her house and the cereal boxes in the kitchen cabinet. In the end, the DNA results were conclusive. Saliva found on Shara's toothbrush tied him to the decades-old crime. In 2017, 48-year-old Shara was extradited from Connecticut back to Massachusetts, where police formally charged him with the slaying, aggravated assault, and abduction. It took Noelle several months to work up the courage to visit Shara at the Hampton County Correctional Center. She waited for him on one side of a plexiglass partition until he arrived in a red jumpsuit and sat on a stool on the other side. Over the jailhouse phone, he attempted to make small talk, telling her that the food was not so bad and that his brother had sent him some books. After listening for several minutes, Noelle stared into his eyes and unloaded. After she yelled at him, he just blankly stared back at her. He did not say a word. In 2019, 50-year-old Gary Shara went to court and changed his plea from not guilty to guilty. He was given a life sentence with no chance of parole. 10-year-old Katherine Lyon and her sister, 12-year-old Sheila Lyon, lived in Kensington, Maryland in 1975. They lived with their parents, John and Mary, as well as their older brother, Jay. On March 25, 1975, Sheila and Katherine left their home between 11 a.m. and noon. Their mother instructed them to get back home by 4 p.m. They were heading to see the Easter exhibits in the Westfield Wheaton Plaza shopping mall, which was located about half a mile from their home. It was their spring break, so they planned on enjoying a day out, even having lunch at a pizzeria within the mall called the Orange Bowl. By 7 p.m., the Lyon sisters had still not returned home. Their parents then called police to report them missing. The extensive search and investigations for Sheila and Katherine revealed nothing about the location of the girls, but thanks to witness statements, it did help the police set up a timeline that they felt was accurate. At 1 p.m., a neighborhood boy saw the sisters outside the Orange Bowl. They were speaking to an unidentified man. At about 2 p.m., their elder brother Jay also noticed them at the pizzeria, alone and enjoying their meal. A friend of theirs then saw the girls walking westward down a street near the mall somewhere between 2:30 and 3 p.m. It was the direct route to their home. That was the last time Sheila and Katherine Lyon were seen alive. The neighborhood boy who recalled seeing Sheila and Katherine talking to someone outside the Orange Bowl described the unidentified man to be about 6 feet tall, 50 to 60 years old, and wearing a brown suit. He said that the man was carrying a briefcase with a tape recorder inside. The man was demonstrating a type of audio cassette player to the teens and children gathered near him, which included the Lyon sisters. 2 composite sketches of him were created and released to the public, and several other witnesses came forward to declare that they had seen him in the mall that day. A girl around Sheila and Katherine's age then talked to the detectives and gave them a completely new possible suspect. She described how the young girls had confronted a man who had been staring so intently at them that it made them uncomfortable enough to act. He was described as a white male, 5 foot 11 inches tall and weighing roughly 140 pounds. It was believed he was in his late teens or early 20s. He had acne on his face and scars on his left cheekbone. The man wore a light-colored Peters jacket, as well as a blue and white horizontal striped shirt with white pants. The Lyon sisters' disappearance shattered the sense of security in Kensington, Maryland, rattling parents to the point where they no longer let their children play outside or walk to Wheaton Plaza. Even with all the promising information, the case soon got plagued by false leads and questionable subjects, eventually making it go cold. An 18-year-old named Lloyd Lee Welsh went to a security guard at the Wheaton Mall a week after the girls disappeared. He said that he had been at the mall that day and saw the girls get abducted by the tape recorder man. Mall security then called the police, who took Lloyd to a nearby station. When the investigators made Lloyd take a lie detector test, he failed. Lloyd then confessed to having made the whole thing up. It was believed he was just interested in the $9,000 reward money being offered, and he was released. On April 7, 1975, about 2 weeks after the disappearance, a witness in Manassas, Virginia, reported seeing 2 girls resembling the Lyon sisters in the rear of a beige 1968 Ford station wagon. The witnesses stated that the girls were bound and gagged in the vehicle. The driver of the vehicle resembled the man in the publicly available composite sketch. The witness further claimed that when the driver spotted the witness tailing him, he ran a red light and sped west on Route 234 towards Interstate 66. The station wagon had Maryland license plates with the possible combination of DMT6. The last 2 numbers are unknown due to the bending of the car's plate. The known combination was issued in Cumberland, Hagerstown, and Baltimore at the time. This supposed sighting inspired a small army of mobile CB radio users to scour the area throughout the night with a running commentary and chatter, but without any tangible results. A search for matching plate numbers failed to produce any information. Although this witness's report was at first treated as credible, and a media firestorm erupted because of it, it was later deemed questionable by police. The disappearance granted calls from psychics, extortionists, and attention seekers. Several phone calls from people claiming to be holding the girls for ransom were made to the Lyon family in the immediate aftermath of their disappearance. One began with an anonymous mail on April 4, 1975, and demanded that John Lyon leave a briefcase with $10,000 inside an Annapolis courthouse restroom. John Lyon left $101 in the briefcase, as directed by law enforcement officials. It was just enough to make the crime a felony, but the briefcase was never claimed. The same anonymous person called John later and said there were too many police officers around the courthouse and he could not retrieve the ransom. John said he would have to hear the girls' voices before he could do anything else. The caller never made contact again. There were suspects, but nothing that linked them to the crime, one being Fred Howard Coffey. Coffey was convicted in 1987 for assaulting and strangling a 10-year-old girl in North Carolina in 1979. Authorities learned that he interviewed for a job and was subsequently employed in Silver Spring, Maryland, 6 days after the Lyon sisters vanished. This is a short distance from Wheaton Plaza. Investigators were unable to determine if Coffey was connected to the case, and he was never charged in the disappearances. Raymond Rudolph Molesky Sr., a resident of Suitland, Maryland, at the time of the disappearance, took the lives of both his wife and teenage son in November 1977. He was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Based on both prison informants' tips and Molesky's own claims to know something about the case, which he offered to share more fully in exchange for more favorable prison conditions, authorities searched his former residence in April 1982. No evidence was discovered. Raymond Rudolph Molesky passed away in prison in 2004. Police interviewed countless witnesses and followed hundreds of tips. Every stand of woods or weeds were searched. Storm sewers were explored, as was every vacant house for miles. The residents of a nearby nursing home were interviewed one by one. Scuba divers groped through mud at the bottom of ponds. Nothing was found. Nothing came of anything the police did. The case haunted the Montgomery County Police Department. Generations of detectives had come and gone, and many had taken a crack at it. Periodically, a new team would start over, combing through the many boxes of yellowing evidence, hoping to find something missed. In 2012, the Montgomery County Police Department decided to make one final push to solve the Lyon sisters' mystery. Their approach was to act as if a call had just come in for the two missing girls and to scour the boxes of case records as if starting from scratch. One of the most intriguing finds early on was a brief report written by investigators a week after the disappearances. The report was about 18-year-old Lloyd Lee Welsh that falsely claimed to see the tape recorder man abduct the sisters. The detectives newly plowing the case learned that Lloyd Welsh went on to compile an extensive criminal record. His record includes an arrest in 1977 in Montgomery County for breaking into a house 8 blocks from Wheaton Plaza Mall and stealing $580 worth of jewelry. The burglary case yielded a mugshot, which bore a striking resemblance to a composite sketch drawn in 1975 of the man at the mall who stared at the Lyon girls so long that they confronted him. The newly assigned detectives learned Welsh was imprisoned in Delaware after being convicted of assaulting a 10-year-old girl in that state in 1998. Detectives drove to see him, not sure what to expect. Would he even want to talk to them? It turns out he did. Welsh talked and talked for 8 hours. It was on October 16, 2013, that Detective Dave Davis traveled with Montgomery Deputy State's Attorney Pete Feeney to Dover, Delaware, to interview Welsh. He acknowledged he was at the mall the day the Lyon sisters were reported missing, but said he had no involvement in their disappearance. The investigators continued trying to uncover as much as they could about Welsh. They learned that his mother lost her life when the car driven by his drunken father, Lee, crashed. Lloyd Welsh was a passenger. He was placed in foster homes, but ran away to live on the streets instead, where he did whatever he wanted to. As an adult, he traveled around the country, sometimes hitchhiking, and at one point started a landscaping business in South Carolina. In that state, he was also convicted of assaulting a 10-year-old, just like in Delaware. As the detectives gathered Welsh's history, they repeatedly returned to interview him in Delaware. In subsequent interviews, Welsh lied elaborately and repeatedly about his connection to the Lyon case. He eventually admitted that he had helped kidnap the girls, but insisted that the crime had been planned and carried out by others in his family. He would talk for hours, shifting his story and offering names of relatives he said he had seen abduct the Lyon girls and hold them captive. In the summer of 2014, investigators began an extensive probe of the entire Welsh clan. What the detectives found shocked them. The clan had two branches, one in Hyattsville, Maryland, and the other 5 hours southwest on a secluded hilltop in Thaxton, Virginia. It was a place locals called Taylor's Mountain. Here, the family's Appalachian roots were still in existence, even though some members had gradually moved into more modern communities in and around Bedford, the nearest town. The family's mountain hollow ways, a suspicion of outsiders, an unruly contempt for authority of any kind, stubborn poverty, a knee-jerk resort to violence, set it perpetually at odds with mainstream suburbia. During one of the interviews, Welsh named relatives he had seen abuse and take the lives of at least one of the Lyon girls. If the sisters had been taken by this family, as Welsh claimed and the detectives now suspected, then someone in the family might help investigators with more information. In 2015, Welsh was claiming that the chief culprit had been his uncle Richard, who he said had planned the girls' kidnapping and demise. Richard Welsh was nearly 70 at the time, but seemed older. In addition to heart trouble, he faced a frightening array of accusations. Various family members had accused him of ugly and violent behavior toward them in the past. Richard Welsh denied it all. He was summoned to appear before a grand jury in February 2015, where he still stuck to his story. He said he never saw either of the Lyon sisters and did not know what happened to them. On May 12, 2015, detectives visited Lloyd Welsh again to see if he could tell them anything else. He continued spinning one story after the next to explain what had happened to Sheila and Katherine, always placing the blame for the crime on others. Gradually, and often inadvertently, he revealed more and more about himself and the crime. The detectives came to realize that you had to forget the narrative. The way to read Welsh was to look past his stories to their details. Running through many of his versions were certain particulars that recurred: stalking girls in the mall, a station wagon, a crying girl in the back seat, a basement accessed from the backyard, an axe, an army green duffel bag, and a bonfire. On a Monday in May 2015, Detective Dave Davis went looking for the place where Welsh said his Uncle Richard had taken Katherine's life, before stuffing her remains in a duffel bag and ordering him to take it to Taylor's Mountain. Uncle Richard's old house had been completely destroyed to make room for a new district court building, but Dave knew where it had been. Right away, Welsh's story didn't add up. The house was the last place you would bring two little girls who were the object of a massive manhunt. The house was right next to police headquarters. Dave next sought out Buchanan Street, which Lloyd Welsh had also mentioned and where members of the Welsh family had once lived. When Dave arrived there, he recognized the house from snapshots in the police file. It was the house where Lloyd Welsh's parents had lived. The current owners of the house led Dave to a basement, only accessed by walking around the house to the rear. Dave stepped into a dark, low-ceilinged stone dungeon heaped with old furniture. This was the place. He knew it. It was exactly where one would stash two frightened young girls. You could do anything without being seen or heard. Dave returned the next day with a forensics team. They squirted Blue Star spray to try and find any blood. It lit up from the floor to the ceiling. The room announced itself as the place where Sheila and Katherine Lyon, or at least one of them, spent their last moments. Welsh often talked about his Uncle Richard's sanctuary, but that was all untrue. This was the space where Lloyd Welsh hung out. It was his. Not long after Dave Davis found the likely crime scene, the case against Lloyd Welsh was solid enough to charge him. On September 12, 2017, he pleaded guilty to ending the lives of both Sheila and Katherine Lyon. Despite pleading guilty, he still claimed that his involvement was in fact very limited. He was given a 48-year sentence, and given that he was 60 years old in 2017, it was essentially a life sentence. Frustratingly, Lloyd Welsh still refuses to tell investigators where they can find the bodies. Investigators are still looking into the possibility that Lloyd Welsh did not act alone. Uncle Richard worked as a mall cop around the same time, and it would have been much easier for him to abduct the two girls than it would be for Lloyd Welsh. Let me know what you make of the case down in the comments section. Roger Scott Dunn was born on February 10, 1967 in Lubbock, Texas, one of two sons born to Jim and Mary Sue Dunn. Everyone referred to him as Scott. Scott was described as a jokester, fun-loving, and as a ladies' man. By 1991, the 24-year-old left the military and settled in Lubbock. He worked at MGM Electronics, where he installed custom sound systems in vehicles. He loved working on cars, and he had even won stereo installation competitions. He also bought, restored, and resold used automobiles on his own. Scott dated Leisha Hamilton. She was a 28-year-old waitress. On the evening of May 13, 1991, Scott attended a party at one of his friends' homes. Out of nowhere, Scott got seriously ill. He couldn't walk or drive home and slept at his friend's house. The next morning, Leisha came to pick him up so that he could rest in the comfort of his own bed at the apartment they shared at Oakwood Club Apartments at 5818 24th Street. The day after that, on May 15th, Scott was finally feeling well enough to get back to his work. His car was still at his friend's house, so he arranged for his friends to take him to work. He told Leisha about this arrangement. She made him tea and left for work. When his friends arrived at their apartment, Scott didn't answer. Leisha arrived home later and told his friends that he must have left while she was at work. Scott did not come home that night, and for the next 2 days there was absolutely no sign of him. Leisha then contacted Jim Dunn, Scott's dad, who lived in Pennsylvania, and told them that Scott disappeared. Jim Dunn then contacted the Lubbock Police Department to file a missing persons report. Jim told detectives that it was unusual for Scott to leave his Camaro, nicknamed the Yellow Submarine, and his tools at work. When the police arrived at Leisha and Scott's apartment, Leisha immediately told the police that a piece of carpet was missing from underneath the couch. In Scott's bedroom, the police found that missing piece of carpet. It had been duct taped together with the carpet in the bedroom. A piece of carpet had been removed from the bedroom. Along the seam, the police noticed a rusty-colored stain. It was clear that it was blood. There was another large stain on the padding underneath the carpet in one section. The blood on the padding had seeped down to the concrete below. It also looked like someone had cleaned blood off of the baseboard of the wall. The investigators used luminol to test the room. The room lit up. It was obvious that someone, presumably Scott, had suffered a violent attack. Investigators looked at Scott's life and the people he knew to see if anything stood out to them. Scott had a previous arrest for using illegal substances. At age 23, he was arrested in connection with a Domino's Pizza robbery. The police followed up on this to see if anyone might have had reasons to hurt Scott because of the substances or money. They didn't find anything useful. Looking at Scott's relationship with Leisha, investigators found a lot of oddities. It seemed that Scott wasn't able to commit to Leisha as much as she would have liked. 1 month before Scott's disappearance, Leisha had learned that Scott was engaged to another woman. Investigators saw this as a possible motive. Could Leisha have sought revenge against Scott? Scott's friends told investigators something worrisome about Leisha. A family friend of Scott said that Scott was afraid to break up with Leisha. Leisha's ex-boyfriends warned Scott that she could lather herself up into violent, jealous rages. Leisha continued to contact Jim to talk about the case. Jim taped all of their phone calls. For some reason, Leisha didn't really seem that interested in finding Scott. She often talked about his sports car. She even asked Jim if she could have it. Leisha told Jim that she didn't want the car but needed it. Leisha was clearly getting impatient about having to wait for the car. This was really odd behavior. Investigators learned that Leisha had a criminal record. She had been arrested in New Mexico for embezzlement. Investigators continued looking into the possibility that she was responsible, but then she actually came up with the first suspect. Leisha told Jim that she believed a man named Tim Smith was involved in Scott's disappearance. Tim lived near Scott and Leisha and became infatuated with her. The police went to speak to Tim at his apartment and saw that he was packing up to move. Tim willingly let the police search his apartment. When the police walked back out to the room where Tim was standing, they discovered that Tim had moved a roll of duct tape that was on his bookshelf. Tim claimed he didn't move anything, but the police found it hidden behind some books. The tape was sent in for forensic testing. Using infrared lights to look at different wavelengths and components of the tape, the results were that the tape from Tim's apartment were consistent with the tape used on the carpet in Scott's bedroom. On the side of the tape, triangular green carpet fibers were found, which were the same color as the carpet in Scott's bedroom. Unfortunately, without a body, there wasn't much else investigators could do, and the case went cold. Jim got impatient and set out to find answers himself. He met with a group called the Vidach Society. It's a group of 82 international forensic experts. The group is a members-only group that meets in Philadelphia to try to solve unsolved crimes. Jim met with Richard Walter, a co-founder of the group, to go over the case of his son. Richard immediately confirmed that Scott is not alive anymore. Furthermore, he was convinced that Leisha held the answers. Richard sent the information to Dr. Richard Shepard of New Scotland Yard. Dr. Shepard concluded that Scott's life was taken in his bedroom and had been struck multiple times with a blunt object. He conducted multiple tests and confirmed that with the amount of blood that was lost, no one could have survived. Richard Walter begged the district attorney to take this case to trial. Richard said that they didn't have a body, but had a body part, the blood's connective tissue. Richard Walter noticed that there were unidentified hairs in the duct tape found in Scott's bedroom. It was sent in for testing and was determined to be hair from both Tim Smith and Leisha Hamilton. Smith and Hamilton were finally arrested 3 years after Scott disappeared in 1994. It is believed that Scott's life was taken in the early morning hours of May 16, 1991, while he was asleep. Scott was struck 4 times with a blunt object. Hamilton and Smith tried to clean up the scene, but obviously left behind too much evidence. It is believed that Leisha wanted revenge after finding out that Scott had been seeing other women and was engaged. Smith probably helped Hamilton because she manipulated him and he was obsessed with her. They were tried separately and both convicted. Leisha Hamilton was sentenced to 20 years in prison, and Smith was sentenced to 10 years of probation. The jury believed that Smith was involved in helping Hamilton clean up and get rid of evidence, but weren't convinced that he was in the room when the crime took place. It's not clear why Leisha got such a short sentence, in Texas no less, but she had to serve it in full after losing multiple bids for parole. Leisha dropped out of sight once she got out of prison. Frustratingly, neither Hamilton nor Smith wanted to tell police where they put Scott's body. There was much relief in 2012 when Lubbock Victims Assistance Services got word to Jim Dunn that a work crew had uncovered skeletal remains in a sewage system near Scott's apartment complex. Dental records confirmed they came from Scott. On June 16, 2012, the Dunns buried him in a grave beneath a stone engraved with a likeness of Scott's Camaro. Jim was quoted as saying, "I tell everyone that Scott came home for Father's Day." In late November 2010, the sudden disappearance of a young girl shook the tight-knit community of Brambati di Sopra. It's a small town on the outskirts of the Alps in northern Italy. The investigation that followed is widely considered one of the largest in Italian history. This is the story of Yara Gambirasio and a twisted tale that gripped a nation. 13-year-old Yara Gambirasio came from a large, loving family. She was one of 4 children to parents Fulvio and Mora. Her father worked as an architect and her mother as a teacher. Their respective families had lived in the area of Brambati di Sopra for generations. It was a quiet town with 8,000 residents, despite being only an hour from the fashion capital of the world, Milan. Life in Brambati di Sopra could not be more different. Time moved slowly there, and the scenery is quintessential rural Italy, with cypress-lined streets and views of distant mountains. It seemed like the ideal place to raise a family. On Friday, 26 November 2010, Yara said goodbye to her family and set off to the local gym where she trained for gymnastics. She left at 5:15 p.m. to walk the short couple 100-meter route like she had done countless times before. Yara needed to drop off a stereo for her instructor, and then she would be right back home. When 2 hours had passed and Yara had still not returned, worry set in for her parents. Yara's mother, Mora, dialed her number, but the call went straight to voicemail. They waited until 7:30 p.m., hoping their daughter would walk through the door with an explanation of something that was keeping her busy until then. Unfortunately, she was still not home, and Yara's father, Fulvio, called the police. The call went through to Letizia Ruggeri, the magistrate on duty in the nearby city of Bergamo. The experienced magistrate wasted no time in getting authorities out and searching for the missing 13-year-old girl. When retracing her steps, the investigators found out that Yara made it to the gym that day where she saw her instructor. They had done a light training session in preparation for an upcoming competition before Yara left and started the journey back home. The last time anyone had contact with Yara was at 6:44 p.m. when she sent a text message to close friend Martina. She told Martina that they could meet up early the next weekend before the gymnastics meet. There were a few witnesses who claimed to have seen Yara talking to 2 men near a red car, but this could not be confirmed. They were not completely certain that it was, in fact, Yara. Tracker dogs were brought to the gym to try and trace Yara's route home. Instead, the dogs led their handlers in the opposite direction towards Mappolo, a small commune located less than 10 minutes from Brambati di Sopra. Yara's phone records confirmed that her phone had been in Mappolo at 6:49 that evening. As is standard procedure in missing persons cases, the family is always questioned by authorities. Each member of the Gambirasio family was thoroughly interviewed, which meant the investigators were able to rule them out as potential suspects. Mora and Fulvio were respected members of the community, and Yara was loved dearly by them and her 3 siblings. The Tazia Ruggeri authorized wiretaps on hundreds of cell phones belonging to possible suspects and had her team try to track down the 15,000-odd devices that had passed through Mapolo on November 26th. This led to the identification of their first suspect, a Moroccan man named Mohammed Fikri. A conversation had been overheard where Fikri asked God for forgiveness and mentioned something about not being responsible for taking her life. At the time of Yara's disappearance, Fikri was working in Mapello on a building site. By the time investigators believed he may be linked to the case, he was already gone. Fikri had boarded a boat heading for Tangiers, a city in northwestern Morocco. The Italian authorities weren't going to give up that easily and set out to intercept the boat. The mission was successful, and Fikri was arrested. His van was subsequently searched, and lo and behold, a mattress with dried red stains was discovered inside. It seemed like they could be on the right track to finding out what happened to Yara, until further investigation revealed that the mattress was unrelated to the investigation, and that the supposed phrase heard over the wiretap had been mistranslated. Now, the investigation began to slow, as no obvious fresh suspects stood out to the authorities. The case had garnered national attention, with the mystery of Yara's disappearance being broadcast on countless Italian TV shows and reporters from across the country filing into Brembati di Sopra. The Gambirasios knew the attention was good for Yara's case, but nonetheless found the intrusion during such a difficult time hard to bear. Over the next 3 months, the scores of investigators working on Yara's case tracked down every possible lead, checked every possible sighting, and interviewed any possible suspects. Mora and Fulvio were still holding on to the hope that their beautiful young daughter was alive somewhere and would be brought home to them. Tragically, that hope was crushed on February 26, 2011, 3 months after she was last seen. Lario Scotti had been flying his model airplane in a town 6 miles or 10 kilometers south of Brembati di Sopra. He chose an area away from any public spaces and over an expanse of scrubland to try out his new toy. Ilario was having some issues with the device, which led to him landing it in an overgrown section of shrubbery and weeds. He walked over to the site and waded through before reaching his plane. As Ilario stood back up, something caught his eye. It appeared there was some fabric on the ground. His first thought was that someone dumped some clothing there. But then Ilario saw a pair of shoes. Upon closer inspection, he discovered the remains of a person. While the person had clearly been left in that location for a long time, a few items of clothing stood out. A black jacket and a Hello Kitty sweatshirt, the same clothing items that Yara had last been seen wearing. Further analysis of the scene uncovered Yara's iPod and house keys. Her SIM card and phone battery was also found, but her cell phone was not. The autopsy was performed by Professor Cristina Cattaneo, one of Italy's most well-known forensic pathologists. Traces of lime were found in Yara's nose and airway, and rope fibers were found on her clothing. This suggested that the person responsible may be a builder or involved in the building trade. Yara's body had multiple marks sustained from a sharp object. The saddest finding of all was that she had lost her life due to exposure, not a direct result of her injuries. 2 DNA samples were recovered at the scene, one on Yara's gloves and the other on her phone battery. The samples were run against the national system, but neither person had been recorded before. All of the items were shipped off for further investigation, including Yara's clothing items. This is how a third DNA profile was discovered 2 months later on Yara's underwear. Authorities believed there had been a struggle and the perpetrator had injured himself, hence the DNA being left behind. The suspect was named Ignoto 1, meaning Unknown 1. Now they just needed to find who this DNA belonged to. The investigators ordered DNA samples to be collected from everyone close to Yara. That included family members, friends, and locals who frequented areas that Yara had. Other officers were in charge of cross-referencing phone records of devices that had moved through Brembati di Sopra and the town where Yara's body was discovered. When a number was found, the owner was tracked down and asked to provide their DNA. This was not glamorous police work. It took hundreds upon hundreds of hours looking through data and trying to put faces to these numbers. Each new sample took a few hours to analyze and get a profile from, with multiple geneticists from across Italy working overtime to get them logged. The search for Yara and the subsequent search to track down the perpetrator has gone down as one of the largest and most expensive manhunts in Italy's history. Yara was finally laid to rest at the end of May 2011. In the months following the discovery of her body, thousands of DNA samples had been analyzed, but still, there had not been a hit against Unknown 1. Letizia Ruggeri decided to look at another angle. She knew that many perpetrators tend to dispose of their victims in areas that they are comfortable in or familiar with. Where Yara's body was found, there was a nightclub not far away. She knew it was a long shot, but Letizia ordered officers to take DNA samples from club patrons outside on busy Friday and Saturday nights. This is how Damiano Gerinoni entered the picture. Damiano frequently attended the nightclub, and his DNA sample bared a striking resemblance to Unknown 1. But he had a rock-solid alibi since he was in South America during the time that Yara was last seen. Still, the authorities weren't giving up on this lead, and geneticists were convinced that Unknown 1 was a relative of Damiano Gerinoni. Every member of the Gerinoni family was looked into, and a shocking link to the Gambirasios was discovered. Damiano's mother, Aurora, had worked for the family as a domestic helper for 10 whole years. Aurora lived near to Yara's home and came over twice a week when she was growing up. Yara and Aurora were close. Aurora always made sure to keep an eye out for Yara, seeing that she did not get up to nonsense, and Yara loved to show off her new gymnastics moves to Aurora. Even though she stopped working for Fulvio and Mora, Aurora maintained a good relationship with the family. So imagine her shock when she found herself at the center of the investigation. It was the worst thing that could happen to me, Aurora later confessed. Both Aurora and her son, Damiano, were extensively questioned. The pair's phone calls were monitored, and they were followed. After months of trying to find any connection between either of them and what happened to Yara, Letizia admitted resigning herself to the fact that, in the end, this was nothing more than a sick coincidence. At the one-year anniversary of Yara losing her life, the pressure on authorities to bring the person responsible to justice was reaching a breaking point. Various politicians were making digs at Letizia, questioning her competence as magistrate, despite her running a textbook investigation from the get-go. But she could not let this background noise distract her from solving Yara's case, so she doubled down on the only viable lead so far, Damiano's DNA profile. They focused on building an extensive family tree of those around Damiano, which resulted in hundreds of names being cataloged. Relatives as far back as 1815 were recorded, until an immense family tree lay before them. This led investigators to the sleepy village of Gorno, where the same families have lived for generations, including the Guerinonis. Damiano's uncle, Giuseppe, passed away in 1999. Investigators hoped they could somehow obtain a DNA sample from him, so they visited his widow, Laura, in September 2011. As luck would have it, she was able to provide 2 stamps that her late husband had licked. The results showed that unknown one was likely Giuseppe's son, making him Damiano's first cousin. Giuseppe worked as a bus driver and was a talented accordion player, putting his talent to use at Gorno festivals. He had 3 children with Laura, 2 sons and a daughter. When their DNA was compared to unknown one, neither came back as a perfect match. Since neither of them had children, the next logical explanation was that Giuseppe had another son out there that they did not know about, one that he did not have with Laura. Letizia described this as an investigation within an investigation. So how on earth would they track down Giuseppe's illegitimate son? Through their deep dive into Giuseppe's personal life, investigators found out that he visited a resort called Salice Terme every May from the early 1960s. It was an annual tradition for him. These trips were made without his wife, Laura. The spring months of 2012 were spent looking through Salice Terme's records, tracking down women whose time at the resort overlapped Giuseppe's. The effort proved fruitless, as did searching through orphanage records and women's shelters. They came to the conclusion that the possible woman they were searching for was most likely married. Divorce in Italy had been illegal until 1970, so even if the mystery woman had an affair with Giuseppe, she likely stayed married. During this time, Yara's parents had hired a freelance geneticist, Giorgio Portera, to look over the investigation and explain to them, in layman's terms, what everything meant. After reviewing the information, Giorgio campaigned for Giuseppe's body to be exhumed so a proper DNA analysis could be performed. The DNA taken from the stamp could only compare part of unknown one's DNA sequence. His wish was granted on March 7, 2013, when Giuseppe's body was exhumed. This effort confirmed that, without a shadow of a doubt, Giuseppe was unknown one's father. He did have a son out there who was responsible for Yara's passing. The authorities kept details of the information private for the most part, much to the frustration of the media desperate for a story. Slowly, rumors started to spread about Giuseppe's illegitimate son, who was believed to have taken Yara's life. As an array of journalists started their own investigation, many affairs and family secrets were uncovered. Things began playing out like a soap opera in the small towns, but a breakthrough was on the horizon. Marshal Giovanni Moccarino worked closely with Letizia. He worked in an office alongside her own. Marshall was a well-liked man with a stubborn streak, by his own admittance. Yara's case had caused him many sleepless nights and 4 years with no breaks, working towards bringing the man responsible to justice. In stark contrast to the high-tech work that went into analyzing the DNA samples and tracking phone records, Marshall was more old school. He liked getting out into the community and talking to people, making them feel comfortable by talking face-to-face. Through this, Marshall found out many details of Giuseppe's life. As previously mentioned, Giuseppe worked as a bus driver, and Marshall managed to track down his old colleagues. The main bus route for the drivers was taking factory workers to the abundant textile factories in the area. Many of these passengers were women. The drivers often described Giuseppe as somewhat of a ladies' man. While Marshall became acquainted with every aspect of Giuseppe's life, a name came up: Esther Asruffi. Esther was born and raised in Ponte Selva, where Giuseppe lived since the early 1960s. Giuseppe actually lived not far from Esther at the time. When she was 19 years old, Esther got married and moved to a nearby village. She worked at a textile mill and would take the bus daily to her job. This is how Esther met Giuseppe. Her husband was a sickly man who used a cane, and during her frequent trips in Giuseppe's bus, Esther fell in love. Did investigators finally have their missing link? Letizia and her team checked their database to see if Esther happened to be on file. They found that a sample had been taken from Esther back in 2012, but a lab error meant it was not showing on the system. The result was conclusive when the moment came to run Esther's DNA against Unknown One. Unknown One was Esther's son. Had her sample been correctly logged in the first place, this very well may have come to light 2 years earlier. Esther left the home with her husband and they moved back to Ponte Selva in 1970. The couple welcomed twins that same year, a boy and a girl. The little boy was named Massimo. In 2014, Massimo Bossetti was 44 years old and married with children. The family lived together in Mapello, the same town where Yara's cell phone had last pinged. Now that Letizia had a name, she wasted no time in tracking down Bossetti and collecting a DNA sample from him to compare it against Unknown One. This would be the final puzzle piece if it confirmed that his DNA was found on Yara's body. They knew asking Bossetti directly for a sample would raise suspicion, so they came up with a clever plan. But first, they needed to find him. Bossetti was observed for a few days, where the team learned he had a fairly set routine. He worked in construction and returned home each evening at the same time in his small truck. Bossetti seemed like any other family man. After establishing his routine and confirming what car he drove, the plan was set into action. While Bossetti was out driving, an officer pulled him over and explained they were breathalyzing drivers to catch people driving over the legal limit. Bossetti was asked to blow into the device. His initial response was a chuckle, followed by, "I do not drink." The officer persisted and got Bossetti to complete the test. The officer then looked down at his breathalyzer and explained to Bossetti that it seemed to be faulty, before asking him to blow into a second device. It showed that Bossetti had not been drinking that day, so he was free to go. As he drove off, the officer jogged back to his car armed with 2 quality DNA samples from their prime suspect. They were sent off to the lab immediately and ran as they arrived. By early afternoon, authorities had their answer. Massimo Bossetti was Unknown One. On June 16, 2014, Bossetti was pounced on by police and taken into custody, where he was charged with taking the life of Yara Gambirasio. During their investigation into Bossetti, investigators found that he frequented areas near where Yara lived. He often ate at a pizzeria down the road and would park his car behind the gym where Yara practiced her gymnastics. He also got regular suntans from a local shop. His internet search history showed a twisted desire for teenage girls, and his phone records showed he was in Brembati di Sopra when Yara disappeared. Bossetti intentionally turned his phone off at 5:45 p.m., only turning it back on the following morning. When he was questioned, Bossetti remained silent and claimed he was not guilty. His legal team decided to call the DNA evidence into question, saying that while it may prove he had contact with Yara, it did not prove he was responsible for her slaying. The trial began in mid-2015 and lasted an entire year. It revealed the sheer extent of the investigation, where over 18,000 DNA samples had been analyzed. After multiple witnesses took the stand and dozens of pieces of evidence presented, it was time for a ruling. The Court of Bergamo, overseen by Judge Antonella Pertoja, found him guilty on July 1, 2016. Bossetti was given a life sentence. Yara's case is unique for many reasons. Not only was her loss felt by her family, but the investigation into finding the monster who took her away from them upended multiple other families. Giuseppe's widow now had to come to terms with the fact that her husband had been unfaithful and that his son was the man responsible for this deplorable crime. Bossetti's mother and sister also have to live with what he had done, along with many other scandals that were uncovered along the way. It, of course, goes without saying that the loss of the bright young girl that was Yara Gambirasio is by far the hardest to swallow. We still do not know exactly what happened that night, as Bossetti still maintains his innocence. Maybe, one day, the truth will come to light. In an 18-month stretch from February 2003 to August 2004, 3 young women were preyed upon by a malicious monster out to inflict as much harm as possible. Each of these women had been out in public minding their own business when a man decided he would try to take their lives in a horrific manner, from trauma to the head to using his vehicle as his weapon of choice. Towards the end of 2004, the man was captured and taken into custody. He was found guilty of the charges a few years later, but in a shocking twist, he was linked to another unsolved slaying that had happened 8 years earlier. Amanda Jane Dowler, or Millie as she was known, was born on June 25, 1988, to parents Bob and Sally Dowler. Millie had an older sister, Gemma, who she adored. The girls got on extremely well and were practically best friends. Gemma described her sister as friendly and vivacious with a sparkle in her eye. She had many close friends and was a kind, generous young girl who loved to cheer others up when they were having a bad day. Millie was a bright light in the lives of those around her, making her sudden disappearance all the harder to bear. It was March 21, 2002. 13-year-old Millie left Heathside School at 3:07 p.m. and walked to the Weybridge railway station with a friend. Both girls got on a train and rode to the Walton-on-Thames station. This was one stop before where Millie usually got off, at Hersham. The girls had decided to grab a bite to eat at the station cafe. Millie made a call to her father at 3:47 p.m., telling him she would be home in the next 30 minutes. The girls parted ways at 4:05 p.m. and Millie set off home. The last time she was seen was waiting at a bus stop on Station Avenue, where a friend of Gemma recognized her. CCTV cameras further along the route showed no sign of Millie. Millie didn't arrive home as planned, and worry started to set in. By 7 p.m., her parents called the police and reported her as missing. A large-scale search operation followed by numerous different officers on foot looking for Millie. Police helicopters were also deployed, hoping to catch a glimpse of the young girl or find something that showed signs of her being in a particular area. Local rivers were searched, and the route Millie should have taken was gone over with a fine-tooth comb. When the CCTV cameras along Station Avenue were accessed, a red Daewoo Nexia was pictured at 4:32 p.m. 7 years later, we would find out who was behind the wheel. Detectives working on the case made multiple public appeals for any witnesses who may have seen anything suspicious or seen Millie herself that day. Her disappearance was so sudden that initial theories revolved around Millie either purposely running away or knowing the person who took her. How could a complete stranger have grabbed her at this time of day in a fairly public setting? It didn't make any sense. Millie's family was adamant that she wouldn't have run away. Crime Watch UK aired a reconstruction of Millie's last known movements and featured a direct appeal to the young girl, as Millie having run away was the definite best-case scenario. But her mother couldn't fathom why her youngest daughter would do such a thing. Years later, it was publicly revealed that Millie had written letters saying she was going to leave home and expressing some unhappiness. In reality, these letters were nothing more than a teenage girl writing her completely normal frustrations out on paper after what was likely a typical argument with her parents or sister, nothing more. On March 28th, the police still didn't believe they were dealing with a stranger taking Millie by force. No witnesses had come forward having witnessed any sort of struggle, despite Millie having been seen on multiple occasions throughout the afternoon. They felt it was unlikely she had gone anywhere with a stranger, hence believing she was familiar with the person she left with. 4 weeks went by with few leads and still no sign of Millie. On April 23, 2002, a body was found in the River Thames, and immediately speculation ran wild that this could be Millie Dowler. It was later confirmed that the remains were that of 73-year-old Macy Thomas. She had disappeared the year prior, and her passing was ruled as non-suspicious. Macy likely drowned. Weeks turned into months with still no new information about what had happened to Millie. Frustrations continued to grow for the Dowlers, not understanding how their daughter could just disappear into thin air. As if things couldn't get any worse, the family themselves started facing scrutiny, with Bob Dowler being the main target. Since the police had stated on many occasions that Millie likely knew whoever she had left with, naturally, the media latched on to that person being a family member. While trying to come to terms with their loss, they also had to contend with stories being published and unfounded rumors spreading. Bob Dowler had nothing to do with his daughter's disappearance, which made the focus on him hard to bear. Not only was it a horrific thing to be accused of, but Bob knew that all the time spent looking at him was time wasted on finding the person who was really responsible. Authorities later apologized for the possibility of missing crucial leads while looking at Bob for Millie's disappearance. By June, the authorities spoke to the Dowlers and told them they needed to brace themselves for the worst-case scenario. Bob and Sally continued to send their daughter text messages, hoping she was still out there somewhere. That month, a £100,000 reward was offered by the Sun, but still, no one came forward with any useful information. In September 2002, everyone's worst fears were realized. It was September 18th, and a small group of mushroom pickers were out in Yateley Heath Woods in Yateley, Hampshire, when one of them spotted something in the undergrowth. It was a body. The authorities were immediately identified, and dental records confirmed that they had found Millie Dowler. She was found unclothed, with none of the items she had in her possession when she disappeared. That included her backpack, purse, and cell phone. To this day, none of the items have ever been recovered. The case was no longer a missing person investigation. Authorities were now looking for the person responsible for taking Millie's life. The Surrey police launched the investigation, titled Operation Ruby, to bring this monster to justice. A month after Millie was found, the Surrey police set up a large-scale roadblock near Yateley Heath Woods. Roughly 6,000 motorists were stopped and questioned, but this produced no new leads. Items from Millie's bedroom were taken in for forensic testing, and on March 23, 2003, a year after she was last seen alive, unknown male DNA was found on one of her items of clothing. This led authorities to theorize that Millie had potentially met with the man who took her life before she vanished. Unfortunately, this lead was shortly ruled out. Despite hundreds of people being interviewed, extensive house-to-house inquiries, and a thorough look into some unsavory characters that lived near where Millie was last seen and near where her body had been found, the Surrey police still had nothing. The next possible lead came when the Dowlers received a chilling letter from someone claiming to be responsible for what happened to Millie. It didn't take long to work out the letter was written by Paul Hughes, who was in jail at the time for indecent acts to a young girl. He was given an additional 5 years behind bars for the letter and the threats he made to Millie's sister, Gemma. The prison service made an apology to the Dowlers for not having intercepted the letter before it was sent to them. Other sick individuals also viewed Millie's disappearance and passing as some sort of game. Leanne Newman made multiple phone calls claiming to be Millie before her blog was found. She called Bob and Sally, the police, and even Millie's school. Newman was given a 5-month prison sentence after pleading guilty to making these phone calls. Gary Farr, a mentally ill man, repeatedly emailed those close to Millie and the investigators, claiming she had been smuggled into Poland. Farr claimed her body was nothing more than a cover-up. He was eventually sanctioned under the Mental Health Act for indefinite holding due to being a danger to the public. Behind all of this nonsense, there was still a family desperate to know what happened to their Millie, but the truth was years away. On February 4, 2003, 19-year-old Marcia McDonald was hit over the head with a blunt object, not far from her Hampton home. The incident happened not long after Marcia had gotten off the 111 bus at the Percy Road bus stop. Tragically, Marcia lost her life 2 days later in hospital. On May 28th of the following year, 18-year-old Kate Sheedy was walking home when she noticed a suspicious car parked on the roadside. A man was inside, and the engine was running, but the lights were deliberately turned off. Kate decided to move away from the vehicle and cross the road. Before she even knew what happened, Kate was run over by the car. Proving this wasn't an accident, the man then reversed over Kate's body before racing off. Miraculously, Kate was able to drag herself off the road and find help. Despite the severity of her condition, Kate survived after a lengthy hospital stay. 3 months later, another young woman was preyed upon. Amélie Delagrange was a 20-year-old French student visiting England. Shockingly, Amélie's life was taken in a brutal manner similar to that of Marcia McDonald. It took authorities less than 24 hours to link the cases. On November 22, 2004, a man was arrested for what had happened to Amélie Delagrange. His name was Levi Belfield. Levi Rabbits was born on May 17, 1968, in Isleworth, London, to parents Jean and Joseph Rabbits. It is unclear exactly when he changed his surname to Belfield from Rabbets, but we do know that was his mother's maiden name. When he was still a child, Belfield's father passed away after battling with leukemia. He grew up with his 4 siblings on a council estate in southwest London and attended Crane Junior High School. When Belfield was in his early teens, he was convicted of breaking into a house and stealing various items. That was in 1981. In 1990, Belfield got into a physical altercation with a police officer, which resulted in a second charge. His criminal history is littered with multiple offenses and convictions, but none of them were as serious as what he would later be accused of. Belfield has 11 children with 5 women. His ex-girlfriends later described Belfield's behavior as charming initially before his true colors started to show. All of the women shared the same stories of what Belfield was like as a partner. This is what Detective Chief Inspector Colin Sutton, who worked on the later cases involving Belfield, had to say of the man. When we started dealing with him, he came across as very jokey, like he's your best mate. But he's a cunning individual, violent. He can switch from being nice to being nasty instantly. In 2003 and 2004, Levi Belfield operated a wheel clamping business. This gave him an intimate knowledge of the streets he stalked. Like a wild animal looking for its next meal, Levi would prowl the streets looking for a suitable victim. Detective Sutton commented on this mentality of Belfield, saying, "Belfield has a massive ego to feed. He thinks he's God's gift to everyone. He drives around in his car, feels a bit whatever, and sees some young blonde girl. The young blonde girl says, 'Go away,' and he thinks, "You dare to turn down Levi Belfield? You're worth nothing." And then she gets a whack over the head. It is shown in the case of Kate Sheedy. She was smart enough to think she didn't like the look of his car and crossed the road. He thinks, "You think you're so clever," and whoosh, he runs her over. After CCTV linked him to Amelée's case, Belfield was surveilled by undercover officers who witnessed him talking to young girls at bus stops. It was quite clear that had he not been taken into custody, more women would have lost their lives. On February 25, 2008, Levi Belfield was found guilty of taking Marcia McDonald's and Amélie Delagrange's lives. He was also convicted of his actions towards Kate Sheedy. On February 26th, Belfield found he would be spending the rest of his life behind bars. His defense passed the news on to Belfield as he refused to be in court that day. Levi Belfield was also considered in two other cases: falsely imprisoning 17-year-old Anna Maria Rennie back in October 2001 and attempting to take the life of Irma Dragoshi in December 2003. Both women identified Belfield as the person responsible, but juries failed to reach a unanimous verdict in both cases. Following his convictions, 39-year-old Belfield was publicly named as a chief suspect in Millie's case. This was mainly due to CCTV footage that tied him to the red Daewoo Nexia seen around the time Millie was last seen on the same road that she had been on. Further investigation showed that Belfield's then-girlfriend owned the car, and she lived in the same area as the Dowlers. In an interview Belfield did with the Daily Mirror in 2009, he said, "There's not many red Daewoos floating about in Walton-on-Thames, so we've got to be realistic about it. But then I've got to be careful about how I answer these questions. I did use the Daewoo once, and I was stopped by the police once in it for speeding." It is unclear why Belfield thought this was the right thing to say when being considered for something so heinous. Like Millie's items, the car was never found. In March 2010, investigators felt certain they had their man, and Levi Belfield was charged with snatching Millie from the road and taking her life. Belfield's trial began on May 10, 2011 in the Central Criminal Court, presided over by Mr. Justice Wilkie. It took place over 6 weeks before a verdict was reached. In his opening statement, the prosecuting barrister recounted what happened to Millie on her final day. On this day, an entirely innocent and quite ordinary diversion to a station cafe to buy some chips with some school friends was a decision that was to cost Millie her life, because it meant her taking a fateful journey along Station Avenue. Belfield was found guilty on June 23, 2011, and given a second life sentence. Years later, Belfield admitted to what he had done to Millie. The Dowlers finally had some sort of closure, but still a sour taste was left in the mouths by many aspects of the investigation. Sally spoke to journalists and explained, "Our family life has been scrutinized and laid open for everyone to inspect. Bob said that the price for this conviction had been far too costly for the family." Belfield's defense had viciously cross-examined Millie's parents as Gemma watched on. She later described what she witnessed as one of the worst days in her life. The defense attempted to paint Millie as a depressed teen, not the vivacious girl those around her knew. Millie's story was subsequently brought back into the spotlight on June 30, 2011, when Crime Watch aired a special titled Taken: The Millie Dowler Story. The program detailed the investigation, had witness interviews, and had Millie's family involved. Reconstruction was also featured, where they reenacted how that day unfolded. Millie's family was finally able to show the nation who Millie was as a person beyond the sensationalized headlines. After everything, one question still remained. Was Belfield responsible for more slayings? Patricia Joyce Morris was born on January 10, 1966, to parents George, a retired Army chief, and Marjorie Morris. She was one of 3 siblings, with a sister and 2 brothers. Patsy, as she was fondly known, was born in Birmingham, but moved to Isleworth, southwest London, when she was 13 years old. On June 16, 1980, Patsy disappeared during a lunch break at school. It has been theorized that the 14-year-old decided to walk home that day, as she needed to change into dry clothes after she had been without a raincoat that morning. On her way there, Patsy vanished. 2 days later, a police dog found her body on Hounslow Heath. She had been left face down in a thicket, just a quarter mile from her home. A ligature had been used to take her life. Levi Belfield was 12 years old at the time. After leaving Crane Junior School, he moved to Feltham Comprehensive, the same school that Patsy attended. In fact, Belfield had been her childhood boyfriend. A year after what happened to Patsy, Belfield was convicted of the first official crime of burglary. He wasn't at school on the day Patsy was last seen, and he knew the area where she was found very well. When Patsy's mother learned of where her daughter was discovered, it caused great confusion. She didn't understand why Patsy would have walked through there. We can't understand what she was doing on the heath. She was always told not to go there and never disobeyed our orders, she told the press. Knowing now that Belfield used to hang out there, often skipping school to do so, it does make you wonder. But was Belfield born evil? Could a boy that age really be capable of committing something like that? Following the conclusion of Millie's case, the possibility was explored. When Patsy's father, George Morris, heard about Belfield's connection to his daughter, he recalled a time all those years ago when a teenage boy had called his house and given him a death threat. He believes that was Belfield. He's a local man, which is why it could be him. And it's terrifying to think that someone of 12 or 13 could have done it, George said. Patsy Morris wasn't the only unsolved slaying that Belfield was considered for. In 1990, 51-year-old housewife Judith Gold was found a stone's throw from her Hampstead home, having been viciously struck in the head with an unknown item. Similar incidents took place across London from 1990 to 2004. All of these cases could be linked to Belfield due to the nature of them. The weapons of choice were distinct, the same type of weapons he used on Marcia and Amelie. While they couldn't confirm without a shadow of a doubt that he was the person responsible, he could also not be ruled out in any of the many incidents except for one. On July 6, 1996, 45-year-old Lynn Russell and her young daughter Megan, the pair and Lynn's other daughter, 9-year-old Josie, were ambushed while walking home from a swimming gala. They were then tied up and struck repeatedly with a hammer. Lynn, Megan, and the family dog lost their lives that day. Miraculously, Josie survived. While she was able to make a full recovery, it is highly likely that she still lives with the mental scars of what happened that tragic day. Belfield allegedly confessed to the crime to his cellmate. Belfield denies ever making this confession. His ex-girlfriend, who helped get a conviction in Millie's trial, has always maintained that Belfield was with her that day. My daughter was born in '96, and that was the day of my birthday. He, Belfield, never left my side all day and all night, so there's absolutely no way he could have gone from Twickenham, where I lived, or Windsor, where I kept my horses, to Kent. Do what they say he did, and get back without me knowing he was there. I can hand on my heart, I hate to say it, but I can say hand on my heart he didn't do it, she said. Michael Stone was convicted of the charges after a second trial, following a successful appeal from his first conviction. Michael Stone had been behind bars since 2001. He still maintains his innocence. There have been many other cases that Belfield was considered for, and some that he allegedly confessed to, but as of today, police have not been able to find any substantial evidence that ties Belfield to any of these cases. Maybe one day the police will track down who was responsible for taking these lives, and maybe that man may just be Levi Belfield. Levi Belfield remains behind bars at HMP Franklin in County Durham. He will never set foot in the outside world again. On June 29, 2017, Gemma released a book titled My Sister Millie. In the heartfelt piece, Gemma describes what it was like living through that wild time, dealing with the loss of her sister, the media circus, and the suspicions of her parents. Gemma explains how she found healing. As an excerpt from the blurb reads, "It is the story of two stolen childhoods, Millie's and Gemma's, and about the love that kept the family together as they struggled with terrible darkness and injustice."